I've told this story maybe 100 times now. At dinners, at bars, once to a reporter who didn't believe a word of it. And every single time I get to the same part and my throat goes tight, and I have to stop and breathe for a second before I can finish it. So bear with me, because I was there. I saw it with my own two eyes, and I'm still not sure I've made peace with what it taught me. It was a Thursday in late October. I remember that because the base had just put up the Halloween decorations in the mess hall, these sad little paper bats taped crooked to the windows, and somebody kept knocking one of them down every time the door slammed. I was 23, a junior aide, basically a glorified clipboard with legs. My job that day was simple: stand near the back, hold the schedule, make sure the coffee carafes didn't run dry during the long parts. That was it. Nobody expected anything from me, which is exactly how I liked it back then. The occasion was a decommissioning ceremony. Now, if you've never been to one, let me paint it for you. They're strange events, half funeral, half party. You're celebrating a machine, an old aircraft in this case, that served for decades and is now being retired and parked somewhere quiet to rust in dignity. And the people who come to these things, they're not really there for the machine. They're there for what the machine carried, the memories, the people who didn't come home, the version of themselves they were when they were young, and the engines were loud, and the whole world fit inside a cockpit. The aircraft that day was an old maritime patrol plane, a big, ugly, beautiful thing, faded gray, nose pointed at the hangar doors like it still wanted to fly. They'd cleaned it up for the occasion. You could smell the polish from across the floor. The hangar was packed, maybe 400 people, folding chairs in neat rows, a little stage up front with a podium and a microphone that whistled feedback every time somebody breathed near it. There were flags. There were medals on old chests. There were widows in their good shoes, holding programs they'd fold and unfold and fold again. And up on that stage, in the seat of honor, sat the man of the hour, Admiral Holloway. I should tell you about him, because you can't understand the rest of it if you don't understand him first. Admiral Marcus Holloway was a legend, the real kind, not the kind they print in glossy magazines. 40 years in, chest full of ribbons he'd actually earned. Tall, silver-haired, with a voice that filled a room without him ever raising it. The kind of man who walked in and the air sort of rearranged itself around him. People loved him. I loved him, honestly, in the way young officers love the men they want to become. He had this easy confidence, this certainty. He told stories like a campfire, and you'd lean in without realizing you were leaning. But here's the thing about men like that. Men who have been right so many times, who have been saluted for so long, who have had 400 people sit quietly while they speak. They forget how to listen. They forget that the world is bigger than the room they're standing in. And that, more than anything, is what this whole story is about. The ceremony ran long. They always do. There were speeches. There was a chaplain. There was a slideshow with photos so old they were basically brown. Somebody played a recording of the aircraft's engine starting up, and half the room got misty over the sound of a turboprop spinning to life, which tells you everything about who was there that day. Then came the part where Admiral Holloway took the podium. And the room changed. You could feel it. People sat up. The widows leaned forward. Even the bored kids who'd been dragged along by their grandparents stopped kicking the chairs in front of them. He spoke for maybe 20 minutes, about duty, about the sea, about the crews who flew that old plane through storms and darkness and decades. He was good, I'll give him that. He had the room in the palm of his hand. And then near the end, he did the thing that ceremonies always do. He opened the floor. "Before we close," he said with that warm gravel in his voice, "I'll take a few questions from the audience, while I'm still standing before they wheel me off to retirement like that bird back there." Laughter. Warm, easy laughter. He had them. A few hands went up. Softball questions mostly. What was your favorite mission, sir? What advice would you give young sailors? He answered them like a man swinging at slow pitches. Smooth, charming, the crowd ate it up. I was at the back, refilling a coffee carafe, only half listening. And then I saw her. I almost didn't notice her at all, which is funny now, given everything. She was sitting near the back too, a few rows ahead of me and off to the side. An older woman, maybe late 60s, early 70s, hard to tell. She had this gray wool coat on, the kind that's been good for 30 years and will be good for 30 more. Sensible shoes. Hair pulled back, mostly silver, a little stubborn dark left in it. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't wearing any pins or ribbons or anything that said who she was. She looked, to be blunt about it, like somebody's grandmother who'd wandered in to get out of the cold. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she'd been sitting very, very still through the whole thing, not bored still, the other kind, the kind where someone is listening so hard their whole body's gone quiet around it. I noticed her because while everyone else was laughing at the Admiral's jokes, she wasn't. She just watched him, steady, like she was reading something on his face that the rest of us couldn't see. And then her hand went up. Not high, not eager, just up, calm, steady as a level. The Admiral pointed at someone else first, a younger officer who asked something about leadership. Holloway gave a nice answer. The hand stayed up, patient. Finally, he looked at her, and I saw it, this tiny flicker, a man scanning a crowd and not finding anyone important. His eyes did that quick little sweep, the one powerful people do, the one that sorts the room into who matters and who doesn't. He filed her under doesn't. I'd bet my whole career on it. Yes, he said, the lady in the back. She stood up. That surprised people. You didn't have to stand. Everyone else had just called out from their seats. But she stood, slowly, smoothing the front of her coat with both hands, the way people of a certain generation do when they're about to say something they've thought about for a long time. The hangar got a little quieter. Admiral Holloway, she said. Her voice carried. That surprised me too. It wasn't loud. It just carried clean and even, the way a voice does when it's used to being heard over engine noise and bad radios. I didn't think about that detail at the time. I think about it a lot now. I have a question about an operation, she said. March of 1988, the North Atlantic. A search and rescue tasking that went out in weather the manual said was a no-fly. 3 aircraft were ordered to stand down. 1 didn't. The room went still in a different way now. The Admiral's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. That's a very specific question, he said. It's a very specific operation, she answered. I want to stop here and tell you what the room felt like, because the words alone don't do it. There's a kind of silence that happens when a stranger says something true in a room full of people who have agreed not to talk about it. It's a held-breath silence. A few of the older men in the front rows, the ones with the most ribbons, the ones who'd flown that old plane back when it was new, a few of them shifted in their seats. One of them set down his program. Another looked at the floor. They knew something, I could see it. Whatever she was asking about, it wasn't a footnote, it was a scar. And the Admiral, he recovered fast, I'll give him that. 40 years of command, you don't get rattled easy. Ma'am, he said, and the warmth was still there, but it had a new edge under it, a little thinner, a little cooler. I've flown and overseen thousands of operations across my career. I'm afraid I can't be expected to remember every weather call and tasking from nearly 40 years ago. You remember this one, she said. Quiet, certain, not rude, just certain. A ripple went through the crowd. A couple of people actually laughed, that nervous laugh you do when you don't know what's happening and you want to break the tension. Somebody whispered something to their neighbor. And the Admiral, well, he made a choice in that moment. I've thought about it 1,000 times. He had a fork in the road and he could have gone gentle. He could have said, you know, tell me more, ma'am, refresh my memory. He could have been the wise old sailor. Instead, he chose the easy road, the crowd-pleasing road, The road that men like him have walked so many times they don't even see it as a choice anymore. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly. That almost made it worse. It was a warm, dismissive, fatherly chuckle. The kind of laugh that pats you on the head. The kind that tells the whole room, isn't this charming, this dear old woman with her dramatic memory of something that probably never happened the way she thinks. With respect, he said, smiling out at the audience now, playing to them, the North Atlantic in March will produce a lot of stories. The sea has a way of making legends out of bad weather and good men. I'm sure whatever you heard or whoever told you about it remembered it as bigger than it was. That's the ocean for you. It doesn't lie, but the people who survive it sometimes do. A laugh rolled through the hangar, bigger this time, relieved. The tension broke and the crowd grabbed onto the joke like a life raft. He'd won. He'd taken a strange, sharp moment and turned it back into a warm one, master of the room right to the end. A few people clapped even. I watched the woman in the gray coat. She didn't flinch, she didn't sit down. She didn't get angry, which is what I expected because that's what I'd have done at 23. Stormed out maybe, made a scene. She just stood there and let the laughter wash over her. And she did this thing with her face that I will never, ever forget. She smiled. Not a hurt smile, not an embarrassed one. A patient one. The smile of someone who has stood in much worse weather than this, and waited, and known the wind would change. And when the laughter finally died down, when the Admiral was already half-turned to take the next question, already moving on, already done with her, she spoke again. Soft. So soft that the people up front had to go quiet again to hear it. You ordered 3 aircraft to stand down, she said, and 1 bird went anyway, against orders, into weather that should have killed her, because there was a fishing crew in the water off the Faroes and nobody else was coming. The Admiral stopped turning. 6 souls, she said, in a sea state that was tearing the rescue swimmer's line. The pilot held a hover for 19 minutes. 19. With the rotor icing and the fuel light on and a voice in her ear screaming at her to abort. Now nobody was laughing. And when that pilot got back, the woman said, and here, for the first time, her voice did something. It didn't break. It just got very, very level, the way a voice gets when there's 40 years of something behind it being held perfectly in place. When she got back, sir, you grounded her. You wrote it up as a violation. You buried the whole thing in a drawer because admitting it happened meant admitting that the call to stand down was wrong. And it was your call. The hangar was so quiet I could hear the paper bat tapping against the window in the draft. The Admiral's face had gone a color I didn't have a name for. "Who are you?" he said. And I swear to you, in that moment, 400 people leaned forward at once. But she didn't answer the question, not yet. She just looked at him, this small woman in a gray wool coat, standing alone in the back of a hangar full of medals and flags and men who'd spent their whole lives being saluted. And she said, "You don't remember my name, Admiral. That's fine. Most people don't." A pause, a breath, the whole world hanging on it. "But you might remember my call sign." She let the silence sit for a second. I think she did it on purpose. I think she'd waited a long time to say what she was about to say, and she wasn't going to rush it for anybody, least of all him. Then she said one word. "Saint." That was it, one word, not loud. She didn't even raise her chin when she said it. She just set it down in the middle of that hangar like you'd set a stone on a table. And 400 people reacted at once. I felt it before I understood it. You know how a crowd can move like one animal sometimes? It did that. A wave went through the rows. Heads turned. Somebody in the front said out loud, "No," not like an argument, like a prayer, like a man hearing something he'd decided long ago he'd never hear again. I didn't get it. I was 23. The name meant nothing to me. I stood there at the back holding my stupid coffee carafe thinking, Saint? Who's Saint? Why is everyone losing their minds? But the old men got it. God, the old men got it. There was a row near the front, 6 or 7 of them, the ones with the most fruit salad on their chests, the ones who'd flown that old gray bird when it was young, and every single one of them had gone rigid. One of them had a hand over his mouth. Another had taken his glasses off and was just holding them, blinking, like the room had gone too bright. And one of them, a big old guy, barrel-chested, the kind of man who looks like he was carved out of a dock piling, he stood straight up out of his chair without seeming to decide to. Just up, staring at her, and his voice came out cracked clean in half. "Saint," he said, "you're Saint." "Hello, Bear," she said. And the big man made a sound I have never heard a grown man make before or since. Not a sob exactly, something older than that. He put his hand on the chair in front of him to keep from going down. Now I need to back up and tell you what I learned later, because at the time I was as lost as you probably are right now. Saint wasn't a person to most of the people in that room, not really. Saint was a story. See, in that world, in the rescue flying world, there are legends that get passed down. Instructors tell them to students. Old hands tell them to new ones over bad coffee at 3 in the morning, and most of them are exaggerated or stitched together from a few real things or flat out made up. Everybody knows that. You tell them anyway because they teach you what the job is really about when the manual can't. And the biggest one, the one they told you when you were green and scared and pretty sure you couldn't do this job, the one that got told in flight schools for 30-something years, was the story of the Pharaoh hover. The way the legend went, there was a pilot, way back, who took a helicopter out into a storm so bad that command had grounded everything that flew, pulled 6 men out of the freezing North Atlantic when every rule and every order said it couldn't be done, held a hover for so long, in icing so bad, that the bird should have fallen out of the sky 3 times over. And the only name anyone ever had for this pilot was a call sign that came through the static that night, when the tower kept screaming for an abort, and the pilot kept refusing. The story went that right at the end, when the last man was finally on the cable, somebody on the radio asked the pilot to confirm they were turning for home. And the answer that came back through all that wind and ice was just the call sign and 3 words. Saint Souls Recovered. That was the legend. Souls recovered. They taught it as a kind of catechism. When it's bad out there, when you've got nothing left, you don't think about the bird, you don't think about the orders, you think about the souls. That's the whole job, kid. Souls recovered. And here's the thing they always told you at the end. Every single time. The part that made it a ghost story instead of just a war story. They told you Saint didn't make it. That the pilot who flew the Pharaoh hover never flew again. That the whole thing got buried, swallowed by the brass, scrubbed out of the record, and the pilot just vanished. Some said killed in a later crash. Some said quietly drummed out. Nobody knew. That was the spooky part. Saint saved 6 souls and then disappeared off the face of the earth, and all that was left was the call sign and 3 words. For over 30 years, every young flyer in that service grew up on the story of Saint. And nobody, not one of them, knew Saint had been a woman. Nobody knew Saint was still alive. And nobody in that hangar, had ever once imagined that Saint would walk into a decommissioning ceremony in a gray wool coat and sensible shoes, and stand up at the back, and ask the man who buried her a simple question. Except the man who buried her. Because Admiral Marcus Holloway had known her name the whole time. I looked at him then, the Admiral. And the change in him was the most frightening thing I'd seen in my young life, because it happened so fast and so completely. The warmth was gone. The charm was gone. The master of the room, the campfire storyteller, all of it had drained out of his face and left something underneath that I don't think anybody in that hangar had ever seen. Fear, and under the fear something worse, recognition. He knew her. He'd known her the second she opened her mouth about March of '88. He'd looked at a small woman in a gray coat and made the easy bet, made it the way he'd made 1,000 easy bets, and he'd been wrong. And now 400 people and a row of weeping old pilots were watching him be wrong in real time. "Alina," he said. It came out of him before he could stop it. Quiet. Just her name. And the way he said it told me they had history that went a lot deeper than one storm. "You remember my name after all," she said. "Funny how that works." "Alina, this isn't," he started and stopped. His hand had gone to the edge of the podium, gripping it. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," she said. And for the first time, just a little, the level voice tilted. Not into anger, into something I can only call grief that had finally found a door. "You're standing up there retiring a machine, Marcus. They flew that machine over my head while I was burning out my engine over 6 drowning men you'd left to die. They gave it a ceremony. They gave it a slideshow. And they gave me a violation in a sealed file and 30 years of being a ghost story for children." She took one step forward, just one. "I didn't come here to ruin your day," she said. "I came here because I'm 71 years old and Bear over there called me 3 weeks ago and told me they were finally putting the old girl to rest. And I realized that if I didn't stand up in a room one time before I'm gone and say it out loud, then the only version of that night that survives me is yours." The big old man, Bear, was openly crying now. 2 of the others had stood up to stand with him, hands on his shoulders. "So no," she said, "I'm not going to sit down, not this time." The base commander was moving by then. A 2-star, hurrying down the side aisle with that frozen smile panic of a man whose careful event has just driven off a cliff. He was reaching for a microphone, about to do the thing they always do, smooth it over, thank everyone, move along, nothing to see. And that's when Bear, the big crying man, turned around to face the whole hangar. And in a voice wrecked and enormous, the voice of a man who'd held this for 30 years and was done holding it, he said, "I was on that cable." The commander froze. "You hear me?" Bear said, turning, sweeping the whole room with his eyes, daring anybody to look away. 1988. I was a rescue swimmer on that crew. I was the one she sent down into that water. I watched the orders come through to stand down, and I watched her say no. I was 20 feet under a helicopter that was icing to death, and the only reason I'm standing in this hangar today, the only reason my kids exist and my grandkids exist, is that the pilot up top refused to leave." He pointed at the woman in the gray coat. His arm was shaking. "That's her, that saint. She's not a story. She's standing right there. And they let us spend 30 years telling kids she was a ghost." The hangar had stopped being a ceremony. I didn't know what it was anymore, but it wasn't that. I looked back up at the stage, at the Admiral, at the man I'd wanted to become. And he was just standing there, caught, old, smaller than he'd been 10 minutes ago, the most powerful man in the room, and he had nothing. No story, no charm, no way out. He opened his mouth. And what came out of him next was the last thing in the world I expected. "I gave the order," the Admiral said. That was all. 3 words into a dead quiet hangar, no microphone tricks, no warmth, no story. Just an old man admitting a thing out loud. The commander, the 2-star who'd been rushing to smooth it all over, stopped where he stood. Even he understood that whatever was happening now was bigger than his careful afternoon, and that stepping in front of it would be like stepping in front of weather. "I gave the stand-down order," Holloway said again. "In March of 1988, off the Faroes. That part's true. That part was always true." He wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at her, just her. "You want to do this here, Alina, in front of all these people? Fine, we'll do it here. I want to be honest with you about something, because this is the part of the story people don't like when I tell it. I went into that hangar wanting the Admiral to be a monster. By the time she said the call sign, I'd already decided he was. It's easy at 23. The world's got good guys and bad guys, and you just have to figure out which is which," and he'd laughed at her. "So he was the bad guy, simple." But it wasn't simple. It's never simple, and the next 10 minutes taught me that the hard way. Because the Admiral started to talk, And what he said wasn't an excuse. It was worse than an excuse. It was a reason. That night, he said, I had 4 aircraft in one window. The weather wasn't bad, it was apocalyptic. Forecast said it was going to get worse before it got better, and the forecast was the only thing that night that didn't lie. I had a fishing crew down off the Faroes, and I had a second emergency 40 miles south, a freighter taking on water with 11 aboard, 2 calls, 1 set of aircraft, and a storm closing the door on both of them. He gripped the podium. You all want the simple version. Brass left brave men to die. I know how it sounds, but I made a call that night that no manual prepares you for. I had to decide where to send people who might not come back, and I made the math. The freighter had 11 souls and a position we could reach in the time we had. The fishing crew had 6 and were further out in worse water, in the exact part of the storm the forecast said was about to become unsurvivable. I did not believe an aircraft could reach those 6 and return. I still don't believe it. I believed that if I sent crews after them, I would be trading good aircrew for men who were already gone. He looked at her. So I ordered the stand down on the fishing crew, and I sent everything to the freighter, and I have lived with that arithmetic for 38 years. Nobody moved. And then, he said, and his voice finally cracked just at the edge, one of my pilots looked at my order and decided I was wrong and flew into the part of the storm I'd written off as a grave. He was quiet for a second. And she was right, and I have never forgiven her for it, and I have never forgiven myself for needing to be forgiven. I told you it wasn't simple. The thing is, I believed him. I think most of the room believed him. You could feel the crowd's certainty wobble, because he wasn't lying. That was a man telling the truth about the worst night of his life, and the truth was that he'd made a defensible, sensible, by-the-book decision, and a junior pilot had broken every rule he'd given her and proven him wrong in front of God and the ocean. And if that were the whole story, maybe it's even a tragedy you can live with. 2 people, both trying to save lives, who disagreed about what was possible. But it wasn't the whole story, and Alina knew it, and she let him have his moment, his reason, his arithmetic. She let it breathe. And then she said, very gently, the thing that turned the knife. That's all true, Marcus, she said. And if you'd written it up exactly the way you just said it, I'd have shaken your hand 38 years ago. She let that sit. You didn't make a hard call and own it. You made a hard call and then a pilot proved it wrong and you couldn't survive that. So you didn't write up what happened. You wrote up me. You filed it as a violation of a direct order, which it was, and you stopped the story right there. You never wrote down that the order was to abandon 6 men. You never wrote down that I brought them home. You never wrote down the freighter or the arithmetic or the storm. You wrote down one line. Pilot disobeyed direct order, and then you sealed it. Her voice stayed level. That's what got me. It stayed so level. You didn't bury me to protect the crews. You buried me to protect the verdict. Because as long as the only fact on the page was that I disobeyed you, then you were still right. And I was just a rule breaker who got lucky. She looked around the hangar slow, taking in all of it. The flags, the medals, the old gray bird. I didn't get lucky, she said. I want that on the record before I die. I held that hover for 19 minutes and there was no luck in any one of them. And then she told us about the 19 minutes. I don't think she planned to. I think it just came out of her, the way the worst things do once the doors finally open. She told it plain, no drama in her voice. That was what made it unbearable. She told us how dark it was, how the sea wasn't water anymore, just a black moving wall that came up at the windscreen and fell away. How the icing built on the rotor so fast she could feel the bird getting heavier in her hands, sluggish, the way a swimmer goes heavy when they're drowning. How the low fuel light came on and she did the math and knew that the math said go home, and she stayed. She told us how she put the helicopter into a hover over 6 men in a life raft that the waves kept trying to swallow, and how she held it there. How a hover in calm air is one of the hardest things you can ask a pilot to do, and that this was not calm air. This was the inside of a washing machine the size of a county, and she held it, minute after minute, while Bear went down on the cable, again and again, because the sea kept ripping the men off the line before he could secure them. She told us how the tower screamed at her to abort, how a voice she wouldn't name but we all knew whose it was came over the radio and ordered her by name, by rank, to break off and return, and how she reached up and turned the volume down, not off, down, because she wanted to be able to say later that she hadn't ignored it, she just decided it was wrong. 19 minutes. 6 men. And when the last one was on the cable, frozen and half-dead but alive, she turned that overloaded, iced-up, nearly empty aircraft back toward shore through the worst of it, and she made the radio call that 30 years of young flyers would grow up repeating without ever knowing it was real. Saint souls recovered. She didn't say it like a legend when she told us. She said it like a tired woman remembering the most frightening night of her life, and somehow that was 100 times bigger than the legend ever was. When she finished, the hangar was silent except for one sound. Grown men, crying, all over the room, the old ones who'd known, the young ones who'd grown up on the ghost story and were only now learning the ghost was standing in front of them in a wool coat. And up on the stage, Admiral Marcus Holloway had stopped trying to defend himself. He was just listening. For the first time in maybe 40 years, that man was just listening. And when she was done, he did something nobody expected, something I think cost him more than the order ever had. He came out from behind the podium. He came down the 3 little steps at the side of the stage slowly, one hand on the rail. And for a second I thought, with a kind of sick lurch, that he was going to fall, that this was all too much for an old heart, and the whole thing was going to end with paramedics and a stretcher and a story nobody ever finished. But he didn't fall. He walked down the center aisle, through 400 people who parted for him without being asked, the way crowds do, leaving him a long, empty path straight to the back of the hangar. Straight to her. It took a while. It's a big hangar, and the only sound the whole time was his shoes on the concrete and somebody, somewhere near the front, quietly weeping. I was close enough by then. I drifted forward without realizing it, the carafe long forgotten on a table somewhere. I had a clear line on both their faces. And when he reached her, he stopped, maybe 4 feet away, close enough to talk soft, and for a long moment the two of them just looked at each other, 2 old people who'd carried the same night for 38 years from opposite ends of it. I rehearsed this, he said finally, quiet, almost to himself. You should know that, for years, what I'd say if I ever had to face you. I had a whole speech, about duty, about command, about how you can't run a service where pilots overrule the chain every time they feel brave. He shook his head slow. And I just heard you describe 19 minutes, and every word of it went out of my head, because there's no version of that speech that survives the sound of you saying souls recovered. He drew a breath. It shook. I was wrong, Alina, not about the arithmetic. The arithmetic was right and I'd make the same call tomorrow. I was wrong about what I did after. I was wrong to bury you to keep my record clean. I took the bravest thing I ever witnessed in 40 years of service and I turned it into a sentence in a sealed file because I couldn't stand to be the man who was right about the storm and wrong about the pilot. That's the truth. That's the whole truth. And I am so sorry for all of it, for the file, for the laugh just now at the back of this room, for 38 years of letting you be a ghost. And then Admiral Marcus Holloway, with 400 people watching, did the thing. He came to attention, and he saluted her. You have to understand what that meant. He was a 4-star equivalent legend. She was, on paper, on the only paper that existed, a junior pilot with a violation in her file and no rank to speak of anymore. By every rule of that world, the salute went the other way. Always. That's the whole point of the thing. And he stood in front of all of them and reversed it, held it, A long, formal, perfect salute to a woman in a gray wool coat. It was, I think, the single most powerful thing I have ever seen one human being do for another. It was an admiral telling an entire service, with his body, in the only language that service truly speaks. I was wrong, and she was right, and you will know it. Eleanor's composure, that incredible level steadiness she'd held this whole time, finally broke. Not into sobbing, just 2 tears down a face that had decided a long time ago not to cry in front of these people. She let them fall. She didn't wipe them. And she returned the salute. The whole hangar came to its feet. I don't know who started it. Maybe Bear. Maybe nobody. Maybe 400 people just stood up at the same instant because their bodies decided it before their minds did. But they came up out of those folding chairs in a roar, the widows and the young officers and the old crews, and the applause wasn't applause anymore. It was something rower than that, men shouting, palms slamming together, that old barrel-chested rescue swimmer with his face wide open and wet, bellowing her call sign over the noise. Saint, Saint. But the moment that finished it, the moment that made it permanent, undeniable, impossible to ever seal in a drawer again, that came from the back of the room, from the sound booth, where some young petty officer had been running the slideshow and the engine recordings all afternoon. Because there had been a recording that day. They'd played a piece of it earlier, the engine starting up, that thing that made the old men misty. It came from the squadron's archive. Years and years of tape. Comms, ceremonies, training, all of it, digitized and dumped into one searchable system that nobody ever really dug through. And while Holloway was walking down that aisle, this kid in the sound booth, this 20-year-old who'd been told her whole life the story of Saint, and had just watched the ghost stand up in the back of the room, this kid had been typing into the search bar with shaking hands. March 1988, Pharaoh's SAR. And she found it. The actual tape. The real comms from that real night, sitting in an archive for 38 years because nobody had ever had a reason to go looking, because officially nothing had happened that was worth finding. And when the room was at its loudest, when the cheering was peaking, this kid did the bravest small thing in the whole story. She put it on the speakers. The hangar went dead silent in about 2 seconds because everyone heard the change, the sudden roar of static and wind and a laboring engine flooding out of the PA, the actual sound of that night, 38 years old, filling the room. And through all that static and storm, we heard a voice. A younger Eleanor, calm in a way that didn't seem human, reading off altitude and fuel and sea state while a hurricane tried to kill her, while somewhere underneath her a man named Bear was on a cable in the black water. And we heard the order come through. A younger Holloway, sharp and afraid, ordering her by name to abort, to return, to leave them. And we heard, faint, the click of a volume being turned down. And then the long minutes, the strain, the numbers getting worse. Bear's voice ragged, calling up that he had another one, he had another one, he had the last one. And then, after a silence that lasted just long enough that I think every person in that hangar stopped breathing, we heard it. For real. Not a legend. Not a story told to scared kids in a flight school. The actual voice on the actual night coming out of the actual storm. Saint Souls recovered. 3 words, 38 years old, true the whole time. The recording cut to static, and then to nothing. And in the silence that followed, the only sound in that enormous hangar was 400 people, and an admiral and a rescue swimmer, and a 20-year-old in a sound booth. All weeping at once for a thing that had finally been told the truth about. Eleanor stood in the middle of it, small, gray coat, sensible shoes. Home, the ceremony never really finished. I mean that literally. There was supposed to be a closing, a benediction, a folding of something, a playing of something. The 2-star commander had a whole back half of a program in his hand, and none of it happened because there was no putting that room back together once the tape played. You don't follow the actual voice of a 38-year-old miracle with a chaplain and a thank you for coming. So it just sort of dissolved into people. Into hundreds of people who didn't want to leave, crowding toward the back of the hangar, toward her, wanting to touch her sleeve, wanting to say something, most of them not managing to say anything at all. Bear got to her first. Of course he did. That huge man folded down in front of this small woman and put his arms around her like she might blow away, and he said something into her shoulder that I couldn't hear and wasn't meant to. She held the back of his head with one hand the way you'd hold a child. He'd been 24 feet under her in the black water. He was 60-something now, with grandchildren. He'd had a whole life. She'd given it to him, 19 minutes at a time. I stood off to the side and watched it for a long while. The carafe still abandoned somewhere, my clipboard somewhere else. None of it mattered. Nobody was checking my schedule that day. Here's what happened after. The boring parts. The parts that matter most, actually. The recording the kid found that changed everything, because it couldn't be sealed again. 400 witnesses. The thing was out. Within a week there were people, real people with stars on their shoulders, asking how a SAR rescue of 6 souls had spent 38 years in a drawer marked as nothing but a violation. They reopened the file. I heard later secondhand what was in it. Eleanor had been right down to the comma. One line. Pilot disobeyed direct order. Date. Signature. M. Holloway. That was the whole official memory of that night. A sentence and a signature. But here's the part people don't expect. When they reopened it, when they came to take statements and rebuild the record, the first and longest statement in the new file came from Holloway himself. He gave them everything. The arithmetic, the freighter, the stand-down. And then, in his own words, the cover-up. He didn't soften it. He didn't lawyer it. An aide who saw the statement told me there was a line in it, near the end, that just said, "I was right about the sea and wrong about the woman, and I chose my pride over her record for 38 years. That choice is mine alone." He didn't have to write that. Nobody could have made him. The man was retiring. There was nothing left to take. He wrote it anyway. They awarded Eleanor the decoration she should have gotten in 1988, the high one, the one you don't get for being lucky. There was a ceremony, a real one, 8 months later, smaller than the decommissioning, but the right people were there. Bear stood up front in a suit that didn't fit, crying again, because that was just what Bear did now, apparently, and good for him. And the citation they read out, the official one, the one that goes in the permanent record where ghost stories can't reach it, ended with 3 words. You can guess which 3. Eleanor and the Admiral. People always ask me about that. Did they make up? Were they friends after? Is there some warm ending where the 2 old enemies have coffee and laugh about it all? The honest answer is, I don't really know. I wasn't in their lives. But I know one thing because Bear told me years later when I tracked him down. He said that at the small ceremony, the real one, after it was over, the Admiral came up to Eleanor again. And he didn't salute this time because that had already been said. He just stood next to her, the 2 of them looking at the same wall of photographs, and after a while he said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you'd obeyed me." And Eleanor said, "I know." And he said, 6 men. And she said, "I know." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. Bear said they just stood there together a while longer, 2 old people who'd been bound for 38 years by the same 19 minutes, and then they went their separate ways. Not friends, maybe. Something else. Something there isn't a clean word for. 2 people who finally agreed on what had happened. Holloway died about 4 years after that. The obituary was long and listed all the legendary things. And right in the middle of it, in the part about his proudest moments, somebody, family I assume, had put a single line about a pilot he'd once tried to bury and then spent his last years making sure the record told the truth about. I thought that was something. I thought that took a kind of courage you don't get a medal for. Eleanor's still alive, last I heard, or was recently. Still in the gray coat, I'd bet. Still not making a fuss. She never wanted to be a legend, she just didn't want to be a lie. So that's the story, the whole thing as best as I can tell it. And every time I get to the end of it, somebody asks me the same question. They ask, what's the point? What's the lesson? Why have you told this 100 times? And for a long time I didn't have a clean answer. I just say I was there, it stuck with me, that's all. But I'm older now, about the age the Admiral was that day in the hangar, and I think I finally understand why it won't let go of me. It's because of the laugh. Not the salute, not the tape, not even the 19 minutes. The laugh. That warm, easy, fatherly laugh he gave when a small woman in a gray coat asked him a question and he decided in half a second that she didn't matter. I think about how many times I've done that, how many times all of us do it, how many people we sort in that quick little sweep into matters and doesn't. The quiet ones, the plain ones, the ones who don't come in with rank or medals or a loud voice. How many saints have stood at the back of how many rooms, holding something enormous, while we laughed and moved on to the next question. The Admiral was a great man. That's the part that scares me. He wasn't a villain. He was a great man, and greatness made him certain, and certainty made him deaf, and being deaf made him laugh at the bravest person he ever commanded. So here's the only lesson I've got, and I'll give it to you the way I wish somebody had given it to me at 23. When someone you've decided is nobody stands up in the back of the room and asks you a question you don't want to answer, don't laugh. Lean in. You never know who's been holding a storm for 38 years, just waiting for one room, one time, to finally say it out loud. You never know who's a saint. And you never know how many souls are still out there in the dark, waiting to be recovered by someone who decided the orders were wrong.